Hello readers, welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, originally published in 1985. Before we dive in, I do want to give a spoiler warning. We are going to be going in depth into the content and ideas presented in Ender's Game. Before we dive into the story itself, I want to quickly go over the author's point of view. Card has been criticized for negative portrayals of homosexuality in his works and for publicly declaring himself against the legalization of gay marriage. Despite this, he identifies as a blue dog Democrat. This identification is usually characterized by socially liberal and fiscally conservative politics. Card was raised with conservative Mormon values, attending BYU and the University of Utah. Brigham Young, the namesake for BYU, was also his direct ancestor. Mormonism is a huge part of Card's life and works. He spent a lot of time on the campus at BYU during his studies and after when he was assisting in their theater productions. Additionally, Card has published many short stories which he later adapted into full-length novels, including Ender's Game. Now with that context of Card as a person, let's dive into the overview for Ender's Game. This novel won both the Nebula and Hugo Awards, both of which honor the best in science fiction or fantasy for the previous year. Ender's Game is a militaristic science fiction novel which follows Andrew Wiggin, known as Ender, a child prodigy, as he leaves Earth to attend a battle school for children in space. At the school, humanity is training their next military commander in preparation for a final confrontation with the Buggers, an alien insectoid species on the far reaches of space. The Buggers have had two previous violent wars with humanity, both ending with huge losses on both sides and no clear victor. Now let's dive into the plot and pacing. Ender's Game follows Ender from the ages of 6 to 13. The story is written in a third-person limited perspective, focusing on Ender's actions and motivations. The novel shows Ender's ups and downs and the impact the people he meets have on his growth as a person. This is a fast-paced science fiction story. Now let's talk about the characters. So we've already established Ender as our main character. From birth, Ender is an outcast on Earth. He has loving parents, but intellectually he's well beyond his peers at school, and he lives in a futuristic time where Earth is overpopulated and childbearing restrictions are placed on families. As a third child, his existence requires an explanation of sorts with each encounter. We immediately see him as a gifted strategist who's able to separate his empathy from his understanding of how the world works. By this I mean, Ender has great emotional intelligence, but he also feels a strong sense of self-preservation and has the mental capacity to devise strategies ensuring his own survival. For the rest of the characters, I want to walk through them in separate categories. So the first category is Ender's family. Ender's family represents love and comfort. At home, he has mother, father, and his sister Valentine, who is the person he loves most. Family also represents Ender's greatest fear in his older brother, Peter. Peter is a psychopath, incapable of really experiencing human emotions. Peter, like his other siblings, Ender and Valentine, has a genius-level intellect. However, Peter is ruthless and doesn't have the confines of empathy to hold him back. All three of the Wiggin children, Peter, Valentine, and Ender, were tested for battle school. Ultimately, only Ender was determined to have the ideal mix of strategy and empathy needed for the success of a military commander. Second category is Ender's allies. So firstly, we have Ali, a young Muslim boy around Ender's age who is also a gifted strategist. Ali is the closest friend that Ender has, and Ender views him as a co-captain or second in command of sorts in his practice squad that he forms at the battle school. There are other kids that I would classify as battle school friends for Ender. It's a group of allies that he has at school consisting of children who respect, fear, or admire him. However, there is a level of separation that Ender always feels between himself and the rest of the students at the battle school. The third grouping is Ender's enemies. For the record, I don't think that Ender is so naive as to see the world in black and white and to think if someone isn't an ally, they're an enemy. In fact, Ender spends a lot of time stressing how he doesn't want to fight or hurt others. However, he also understands when someone means harm to him, and his life has been set up as a series of obstacles to overcome. This requires a ruthlessness that Ender never celebrates. We see this in examples beginning at the start of the story in A School Bully. He also has young boys in his launch group when he first journeys to the battle school. There are captains of these groups of boys in battle school. And I think it's important to note that the majority of the bullying which occurs is due to jealousy and Ender's differences. The last group within this category is adults as a whole. So Ender develops a mistrust of adults as he understands that they work to manipulate him for their own means. He knows he can't trust them as they'll never really protect him, even at the risk of his death. Now I want to talk about some of the subtext within Ender's game. So firstly, I think Ender is a queer-coded character. He's described as sensitive and overly emotional. I also think that his relationship with Alai is a bit deeper than a friendship. Here's a quote from Ender's game. Ender turned around. Alai was already gone. Ender felt as if part of himself had been taken away, an inward prop that he was holding up for his courage and confidence. With Alai, to a degree impossible even with Shin. Ender had come to feel a unity so strong that the word we came to his lips much more easily than I. But Alai had left something behind. Ender lay in bed, dozing into the night, and felt Alai's lips on his cheek as he muttered the word peace. The kiss, the word, the peace were with him. Still, I am only what I remember, and Alai is my friend in a memory so intense that they can't tear him out. Like Valentine, the strongest memory of all. The next day, he passed Alai in the corridor and they greeted each other, touched hands, talked, but they both knew that there was a wall now. It might be breached, that wall, sometime in the future, but for now, the only real conversation between them was the roots that had already grown low and deep under the wall, where they could not be broken. The most terrible thing, though, was the fear that the wall could never be breached, that in his heart Alai was glad of the separation, and was ready to be Ender's enemy. For now that they could not be together, they must be infinitely apart, and what had been sure and unshakable was now fragile and insubstantial. From the moment we are not together, Alai is a stranger, for he has a life now that will be no part of mine, and that means that when I see him, we will not know each other. There's another section where Ender's having a dream sequence. Quote, and the other voice answered, I know, I love him too. And then they changed into Valentine and Alai, and in his dream, they were burying him. End quote. Through all of the pain Ender's been through up to this point, he doesn't see his parents, he doesn't see any of his other schoolmates, he doesn't see his first friend at this school, he sees Alai and he sees his sister. We know Valentine's the most important person in his life, and he expresses his love for her all the time, but just to talk about Alai in this way and to see Alai in this dream, to me, it represents something beyond like a simple friendship or a childhood innocence. I think he is in love with Alai, but I don't think it's a stretch to see that connection or that interpretation of the text, especially in the way it's kind of described and Ender as a character in general is described to be. This second piece of subtext I want to highlight is the backdrop of the Cold War and America versus Russia specifically. Ender comments, he knew that lies could not last long in America, so he believed. Ender's Game was written and released during the Cold War, so the depictions here very much mirror American life and Card's own experiences living during the Cold War of America. There's certainly a sense of patriotism for America here. There's a fear of the other, which we see through the buggers and the comparison of America versus Russia at home. There is a unity on Earth during the story because it's essentially humanity versus aliens, but as the war begins to come to a close, more and more the tensions back home increase. Now I want to talk about some of the more present themes within the story. So firstly, we see religion. So in the world that Card has built in Ender's Game, religion is oppressed, with people not being able to legally and openly worship. However, we do see several characters in the story which have ties to Catholicism, Islam, and Judaism. And the story ends with Ender creating a new religion and writing original religious texts, Speaker of the Dead. As we talked about earlier, during the author's point of view, we know that Mormonism and religion as a whole is an important part of the author's life, so it makes sense that he would include religious elements and characters who have these religious identities and cultural identities present within his story. Second, I want to talk about war. So there's really two wars going on within Ender's Game. There's a war brewing, not currently happening, but brewing and ramping up on Earth, and there's a war ramping up and eventually brewing within space. There are multiple comparisons between Ender and Peter and how each boy won their wars respectively, and I think this ties deeper into the parallels which are drawn throughout the text between the two boys and Ender's fear of Peter and what he represents to Ender. This is why each time Ender is forced into violence, he sees Peter and himself and feels revulsion. There's a deep irony in how the two conflicts are resolved, because Ender, who at his core wants peace and is an extremely empathetic boy, is coerced into committing genocide. Meanwhile, Peter, who is routinely represented and expressed to be a psychopath, ends his war ultimately through diplomacy. There's a quote that says, "The bugger war isn't 24 hours dead, and the world down there is back to fighting again, as bad as ever." I think Card is making some statements about humanity's nature of fighting one another and our inability to have peace and coexist. So after the war is over, one of the adults is speaking to Ender, saying, "Any decent person who knows what warfare is can never go into battle with a whole heart. But you didn't know. We made sure you didn't know." Ender is manipulated into taking the actions that he takes. It's to him expressed as a game, expressed as a trial. He understands that ultimately there is a war and there is an expectation that he will be a commander or a leader in the war, but he isn't truly given an opportunity to consider the consequences of the actions that he's taking or has to take, because again, to him, it's a simulation and he hasn't been told of the reality. The war is currently ongoing and he's committing acts of war. So later on, when Ender is questioning why are we fighting, what is so wrong about the buggers, he eventually learns that they can't communicate. They don't have the ability to communicate in terms of words or language at all. Their communication is much more like an ant or a bee, where there's a sort of hive mentality to it, much different than the independence that humanity understands. So to this, Ender observes the whole war is because we can't talk to each other, which again is a comparison to the conflict on Earth that Peter and Valentine both are involved in, which leads us to the next topic of politics. There's a subplot during the story where Peter and Valentine, they take on these personas of political theorists, and they essentially take to the web and post thoughts on the growing conflict, and to some extent they provoke fear and anxiety among Earth, ultimately to gain respect and power at a later point after setting up a conflict to essentially then resolve it. They're able to manipulate and sway public opinion. And when thinking about it, Valentine says, "Peter used Valentine to test his ideas, to refine them. In the process, she also refined her own thinking. She found that while she rarely agreed with Peter about what the world ought to be, they rarely disagreed about what the world actually was." I thought this was a really interesting point, because Valentine and Peter have a unique relationship where they don't exactly have trust or love amongst each other, but she always does respect him in a way. And even through all of their differences in thought, they're able to understand and come together on what the world actually is, which I think a lot of people would say more and more today is less common. Going back a little bit to humanity's nature of potentially violence, there's also a theme of colonization. As soon as the Bugger War ends, Earth leaves to colonize the Bugger's former colonies, showing the hypocrisy and the stupidity, really, of this them versus us mentality, where humanity is so scared of becoming a colony to this alien race just to then destroy the alien race and take all of their former homes, which we, of course, see throughout human history and human civilization has been done. But now we're just going out into space and doing it again. So, why are children such a pivotal part of this story? Well, firstly, we can point to the quote about war again, where they essentially say a naivety and an innocence is needed in order to do what humanity deems must be done, and humanity can live in peace, which, as we've already discussed, is pretty hypocritical considering that humanity then goes back to fighting one another. However, the other piece of hypocrisy is that we're not only destroying our enemies, but we're also destroying the lives and the innocence of these children who are being manipulated into war. So that's where I want to talk about the idea of childhood lost. Ender in Battle School is playing games. He's fantasizing about a fairyland, which is presented in one of his games, and he's also thinking about Earth and the beauty of it, and Valentine specifically, and saving her and all the other great, brilliant connections on Earth. He's able to empathize with humanity and understand why saving the Earth is important and why he must carry on in his duties at Battle School. However, through all of this, he's also able to recognize that he's being used by the adults. He still craves their approval despite what he tells himself, and I think this comes ultimately from the human need for connection, which Ender is deprived throughout the story. Anytime he makes a friend or an acquaintance, there are boundaries set up by the adults. There are new rules put in place to put Ender at a disadvantage. And there's still this aspect of bullying which exists without the safety of a normal school where hopefully adults or teachers would step in to protect children. Above all of this, though, Ender's biggest bully, again, is his brother Peter, who he fears immensely. Eventually, Ender and Valentine have a conversation about Peter, in which Valentine asks, "Do you want to beat him?" And Ender answers, "I want him to love me." We're seeing again the connection between Ender's ability to empathize. Above all, Ender expresses empathy and love for others. He doesn't want violence, and that's not something that he craves. However, he is able to use his empathy as a weapon. He understands his enemies so well that he's able to fully destroy them. And about this, he thinks, "I'm doing it again," thought Ender. "I'm hurting people again just to save myself. Why don't they leave me alone so I don't have to hurt them?" So let's talk about some of the good and the bad elements of Ender's Game. Firstly, all of the characters are deeply complex and conflicted, but the majority also have really likable qualities. It's always something I want to see in a story is well-rounded, deep, realistic characters. Secondly, the story is really fast-paced. It's super enjoyable. I wanted to read it. I picked it up and read through it super quickly because I was invested, and it was fun and exciting and easy to read. Also, the complexities of subplots. So, what are the adults doing? What's Ender doing? What are Peter and Valentine doing on Earth? They all add intrigue to the text and provide importance behind the characters and their motivations, so that we're not just introduced to Valentine and Peter at the beginning of the story and we never see them again, but they have important parts to play, important roles to play, not just in Ender's life and in his emotional development, but within the story and society on Earth as well. My biggest downside is genocide. This is something I've talked about a little bit in past reviews, but a lot of science fiction has themes of genocide in it, especially this kind of subgenre of a militaristic science fiction. This is something that is an important point in future books within the Ender series, and it's also important for Ender's growth as a character, as well as showing the nature of humanity. However, overall, not something that I personally love to be in stories I'm reading. Secondly, the book does have one or two outdated racist or culturally insensitive terms. It was written in the mid 80s. It wasn't anything absolutely horrible, but just expect that if you decide to pick the book up. Going into my final thoughts, I do think that Ender's Game is a true force of a science fiction story. I really, really loved it. I felt like I consumed it. I read it so quickly. This book really stayed with me, and I feel like it's a classic that everyone should read at least once. The questions that the story asks make you think. It doesn't provide super clear-cut answers to all or even most of the questions that it presents. So it really forces you to think for yourself, and I have really found myself coming back to this book and thinking about it, thinking about the characters and the ideas presented for several weeks after finishing it. So that sums up my thoughts on Ender's Game. So if you've read it, let me know your thoughts. Do you agree with my points? Do you think I'm way off base? Let me know in the comments below. If you have any recommendations for further books in this Ender series or similar books that you really enjoyed, please also leave those suggestions in the comments below. Thanks as always so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.